I'm Dr. Chris O'Brien. I'm the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center. This is our probably 18th annual Theodore Roosevelt Symposium. We're not sure how to count the first few, which happened a little more sporadically. Clay Jenkinson, who you'll hear from shortly, tells me he's done 22 of them. So this might be our 23rd, but we'll call it our 18th because we wrote that down a lot. So trust what's in front of you. I've got a handful of quick things to do. Much of what I will do for the next couple of days, when you see me, there's probably going to be food sometime shortly thereafter, but not this time. So instead of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Theodore Roosevelt Center because we're really kind of proud of what we do. If you don't know us, it's a research center. We are trying to create the complete digital Theodore Roosevelt. By that I mean everything that he ever wrote and everybody who ever wrote to him. So that's 35, 40 books, depending on how you want to count. We have a little debate in our office. It's historians and archivists. Is a 3-volume set 1 book or 3? So these things trouble people like us. The 150,000 some letters. We are partners with a variety of folks who are incredibly important to our success. So that would be folks like the Theodore Roosevelt Association, the current president, David Archibald, sitting right down here in front. We are in the process of digitizing all of the Theodore Roosevelt Association journals, nearing the end point on that project to get us mostly up to date. We will stay with that project for as long as they're publishing, right? We will keep bringing them out. You can pop on now. Dwayne Junt joined our team this year to help bring that into fruition. We're quite near the end. He turns them out in 5-year increments, and we've got about 10 more years before we're caught up to the present. The team that I have, Kelly Hyland, Eric Johnson, William Hansard, Gemma Kuntz, Valerie Naylor, the occasional assist from Clay Jenkinson, and a variety of other folks, a couple of student assistants at most times, 8 interns on through the summer, a pretty good sized crew to try and add data to everything that is Theodore Roosevelt. So I'll just give you my favorite example. What we tried to do is, among other things, figure out everybody who is mentioned, to keep a list of every name and who they are. So that list has, I don't know, 80,000 names on it right now. And some of them are really easy. Some of them are simple. You know the names, you've seen the names. There's not very many Elihu Roots, who's Secretary of State. There are a lot of John Smiths, and so those are harder to run down, but we do try to figure out who everybody is who's ever mentioned and create this grand index of all of it. We have other partners. Recently, about 100 films joined our collection, documentary footage newsreel films called the Simon Sherman? Sherman, thank you, that's William Hansard back there with the correction. The Sherman Grinberg collection. You can see Roosevelt in films that the Library of Congress doesn't have. All up, online, ready to be viewed. We continue to add, we continue to gain partners at all times. We will never get there, but we're gonna try, or we're gonna make a good effort at it. Every time we think we're getting close, what happened this week happened again, which is, somebody wrote to us and said, my grandfather traveled with Roosevelt as a speechwriter during the Progressive campaign. And we have some of the speeches typewritten with notes from both his grandfather and Roosevelt. They just arrived. He's digitizing the photos so they'll be good enough, but they're pictures of his grandfather and Roosevelt on a train, straight up over the transom. We didn't know about the guy. We probably did know about his name, but we didn't know his grandson was going to contact us and say, here's some letters, would you like them? We'll probably never get to the end of the project. I'll tell you, that's a good thing, right? The past is never completely known, and so finding more is an exciting thing. Keeps us going. I could not be more proud of those first 3 folks that I mentioned, Kelly, William, and Eric. You should meet them. And tomorrow afternoon, you can come down to the opening of our new exhibit in the gallery. And here's why I'm so proud of it. They did the whole thing. It's based on our collections. It's Roosevelt's A Life in Letters. So as reader and writer, he's writing when he's a child. He writes all the way up to nearly the day he dies. You should see it. They put the whole thing together. It's our collections mostly, with an able assist from Michael Cullinane, who we borrowed some things from, and a handful of other folks, the Hopes, who are here. I think we borrowed a desk from a local theater company. We've got a handful of things, equipment from local museums, good partners all around. This good work comes to you by the benefit from the benefit of the people of North Dakota, who of course help pay our bills and keep the lights on, and a whole lot of grant support. The Robin and Melanie Walton Foundation, major grantors for us. We are almost 100% grant funded. We have a lot of donors locally, Steffes LLC, the Fisher Industries, and others who make this possible, all that hard work. We are in a good moment where we are driving ahead and hiring people. That's a good thing to be able to say, right? That's a happy moment for somebody like me. We will continue to push along, and more will come on. You'll notice in the back of that program how far we are. Most collections we're completely done with, and then you'll see the Library of Congress manuscript collection, which is the big one, and you will get there. That's a big slog. That's although we're working through presidential papers right now. Last little piece of this is we try not to transcribe much. If you can read it, we try not to transcribe it because we want you to have the experience. But one of his sisters writes in a hand that is quite nearly flat, just straight across the page. And if you spend enough time with Bammy's handwriting, you can kind of figure it out. And I got people who can. I can't read it, but I guarantee no machine can. And I've talked to everybody who thinks they have a machine that can read it. Nobody's even close. The Postal Service can't read her handwriting. So we've probably got more work to do. The last part of this is we do live here on the beautiful campus of Dickinson State University, and it's my honor and duty to introduce my boss, the president of the university, or Dickinson State University, Steve Easton. So.
Thanks everyone for being here. Great to see familiar faces. Also great to see new faces. Never been good with a podium, but you can figure out who's actually the boss here. Yes. And those of you that are accessing this via the internet, we welcome you too. You've got a great program tomorrow. I wonder if Chris introduced them, but I wonder if our TR Center staff could stand up so that you can see who they are, so you'll have a chance to talk to them, and we can thank them. We want to also thank our students from the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program, who will be helping you in all sorts of ways over the next 2 days. We have amazing students at Dickinson State. So thanks for coming. Have a great time. We're really glad you're here. It is my honor to introduce our program coordinator and master of ceremonies. Clay Jenkinson, of course, is much more than that. Clay Jenkinson is, in many ways, well, not in many ways, he is the creator of the concept of the Theodore Roosevelt Center. The work that Chris O'Brien just described, it was his idea. And by the way, not only the idea of trying to digitize Theodore Roosevelt's many writings, and writings related to Roosevelt, but the idea of doing that for a pre-digital president. That's Clay Jenkinson's idea. We are very proud that that idea has come to life at Dickinson State University. It's being copied, which is good, by people on other campuses for other presidents. I'm an alum of Dickinson State University. Another place I'm an alum of is Stanford University, and they're now doing this for Hoover's collection, which means that Stanford stole Clay Jenkinson's and Dickinson State's idea, which is a wonderful thing. But it really was a remarkable concept. I'm sure people told Clay that when he came up with this concept that he was crazy, that you can't actually make that happen. We're very proud that is happening. Clay is also, when you get over to the exhibit tomorrow. He is responsible for lots of that space, but especially we have a little, it's not a recreation because our version of Roosevelt's reading room is much smaller than the actual version at Sagamore Hill, but it is, I guess you would say it's an homage to that amazing room. If you've been in that room, we hope it'll feel a little bit familiar, although again on a smaller scale. Clay did that too, and I was involved in the design of our rebuild, and Clay was there throughout that process, insisting that we do as much as we could to bring back the spirit of that room. And the current exhibit, which is about Roosevelt as a reader and as a writer, is really precious to us because we are a university. And when people generally think about Roosevelt in North Dakota, they sometimes forget about that incredibly important aspect of his life. So if you have a good time in the next couple of days, that's Clay's responsibility, and you should thank him for that. If you have a bad time and you're hating your time here, I guess that's Clay's fault. So you could maybe blame it on him, but we are, all of us are standing on the shoulders of Clay's work. And Clay, thanks for doing it for us. I give you Rhodes Scholar and multiple award-winning humanities scholar, Clay Jenkinson.
That was so wonderfully generous of you. Something of an exaggeration of my own role in all of this, but I'll take it. It is true. We have a few minutes, and we can't start the lecture until 7:30. So I'm going to just tell you just a couple quick stories about all of this. But welcome, and especially to those of you who are here, and with a very special sense of gratitude to the students of Dickinson State University and their faculty. And we're so pleased you're here, and we hope you'll come for more. For those who are streaming in from all over the place, we wish you could be here, because on Saturday we go out to the Badlands. We always make sure that on the last day we go to the Badlands. And many people, including some of the scholars who come to speak here, have never been there before. And it's always an adventure. And this one might be a chilly adventure come Saturday, but we'll be fine. Some of the scholars who have been here have said later, oh, I wish I had come here before I wrote my book, because the spirit of place here is so important. You know, we really feel, I feel very strongly that spirit of place is one of the things that North Dakota has that can't be reduplicated somewhere else. You know, we don't have the finest restaurants in the world and independent ballet and, you know, certain things, but we have character, and that character was forged by the agrarian, which has more to do with Thomas Jefferson, frankly, than Theodore Roosevelt, who loved ranching, was not so sure he loved farming. And so we're so glad you're here, either virtually or in person, and you're in for a great couple of days. So here's the origin story of all of this. It's really true. In 2005, I walked the entire course of the Little Missouri River alone, needless to say. And it was 173 miles from Marmarth to the end. It took 20 days, and it was the hottest summer in modern North Dakota history, 105 degrees by noon every day. And so dehydration was actually a very serious problem. And maybe that's what led to all of this, Mr. President, because I was out there closing in on the Elkhorn Ranch, and I thought, there wasn't a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. The presidential library system began with Hoover. Maybe we could build a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in Western North Dakota. And then I thought, well, no, because the Library of Congress has the papers, and Harvard has the papers, and Denver Public Library has the papers, and the Huntington have the papers, and Massachusetts Historical has papers, and New York Public Library. They're not going to give us the papers. That's never going to happen. But I had just read Tom Friedman's The World is Flat, And I thought, well, if we digitized Roosevelt, we would have a perfect presidential archive. I came back and told this idea to the then president of the university, and he said, okay, sort of reluctantly. If we had known what this entailed, we wouldn't have done it. Because it's so gigantic a project. You know, we thought, a couple of years in a scanner. And now we know that it's a profound labor of love and discipline. And it takes a special kind of staff to want to process these documents, to give them the metadata that they need to be searchable. And I can't tell you how much better the project has turned out to be than what I early envisioned, and how extraordinary the staff is that's just doing great work. You've got to see the new exhibit on T.R. the Writer. It's just fabulous over at our digs just down the way. So then another president and I went to Harvard. We got the Library of Congress pretty easily. They said, sure, if you supply the funds, we will create a complete digital record of what we have. So that was expensive but easy. Then this president and I went to Harvard, and we got in there in the library, and it was a special room with cages because the books were so precious and important. And he and I were sitting there, and then 5 of the senior library deans came in, and they were all dressed immaculately with perfectly groomed beards, and so they just spelled, elegance and Chaucer and Dr. Johnson. And they looked over, they were at one side of the room and we were at the other, and they looked over at us and said, why are you here? And Dr. McCallum nudged me in the elbow and said, you talk. It's like we were with the Wizard of Oz. And so I stammered out something. I said, well, we're from North Dakota. And they said, yes. I said, at Dickinson State University. They said, we've never heard of that. But go ahead. And so we explained what we had in mind, and lasted about 25 minutes, and they asked a few follow-up questions, including the most important one. What makes us think you can pull this off? What if we cooperate with you and you can't do it? Oh, we lied and said, of course we could do it, But then they said, well, go away and we'll get back to you. So we went away thinking, this is not good. And 6 weeks later, they wrote us a letter saying, we've agreed to work with you and to help your project succeed. We wanted to say no, but we couldn't think of a good reason. And so off and running. Now we have the 2 mother loads. And recently, under new relations with the Theodore Roosevelt Association, thanks in large part to Michael Cullinane, we've been digitizing a lot of their holdings too. Valerie Naylor, who's here, got a grant from the National Park Service to digitize the Roosevelt-related records in several of his conservation properties, and it just goes on and on and on. There will never be an end to what comes in. At some point, we'll probably declare an end to what goes out, but no time soon, because everything Rooseveltiana is interesting to us. This is my either 18th or 22nd time standing here. Doesn't really matter, but it's been a long, fascinating journey, and we're still at it. We intend to continue to do this kind of work in perpetuity, and I think it's really fair to say that we have changed the nature of Roosevelt studies with what we do at this small regional university, that scholars routinely now use our archives. We've generated some scholarship and published books. We have exhibits that are ready to travel if other institutions want them. Little Dickinson State University has become a major, even essential player in the world of Theodore Roosevelt studies. Isn't that amazing? I mean, we can do anything. Yeah, thank you. So our theme this time is justice. And I've been thinking a lot about it over the past 6 or 7 months. Justice and righteousness are 2 of TR's favorite words. Now, just how he saw them, how he defined them, what they meant to him is somewhat different from what we now might think looking back on his career. And what strikes me, and I think everybody else who's been involved in this is how wonderfully complex Roosevelt is. You know, his rhetoric is sometimes black and white, but the complexity of his thinking, his reading, his pondering, his policies, his flexibilities as a leader are extraordinary. And so you're going to see this play out in all sorts of ways in the next couple of days. I just can't wait to hear it. My job is simply to be the interlocutor during the Q&A session. It's the thing I most enjoy in the world. I'm bracing myself for Saturday. I slept out in the Badlands 2 nights ago and the heater in my Airstream didn't work, and I died about 4 a.m. But now I've figured that out. So I want to introduce Michael Cullinane, who will introduce our extraordinary keynote speaker tonight. Michael Cullinane is a superb scholar and a rising star in the world of Theodore Roosevelt, and we are just so fortunate to call him our own. Michael Cullinane.
Hi everyone, welcome. It's great to see everyone back again for another fantastic symposium. I think we have a great lineup this year. I just want to add to what Chris had said about, and Clay had said about what we're doing here and why it never stops. I don't know if you saw, you must have, because everyone saw, Kevin McCarthy lost the speakership this week. He, when he made his farewell, quoted Theodore Roosevelt, the man in the arena speech. So the reason why this never ends is because the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt endures. And so this is ongoing. Miley Cyrus has a tattoo of a Theodore Roosevelt quote on her arm. This is never going to end. We're collecting Miley Cyrus tattoos. Okay. I am very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, TJ Stiles. TJ is a multi-award-winning author, which, as I say that, it pales in reality to what TJ has accomplished as a biographer. He is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning, one in biography and one in history, National Book Award winner. He has won every major award. In 2002, when he wrote, 2002, when he wrote Jesse James, which is called Jesse James, Last Rebel of the Civil War. It won the Peter Seaborg Award for Civil War Scholarship. He has published an extraordinary biography of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the world's richest man and railroad tycoon. 6 years later, he published Custer's Trials, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History. And it is an incredible story of America on the frontier and the transition from an antebellum America to a modern or industrial America. As well as writing about figures that we're familiar with, like Custer, Vanderbilt, Jesse James, and now he's writing about Theodore Roosevelt, TJ is the best kind of biographer there is. And the reason for that is that he's able to articulate context in a way that I think is what biography is intended to do. So we know it's a story about a person, but when you're able to connect that person to a place and to a time and set the reader in that place and time, that is the real power, to me, of biography. We talked a little bit about this today because we were podcasting, so there's going to be a podcast episode about a little bit about TJ's methods and how he picks subjects for his biography. But for me, that idea of breaking through the periodization and putting a person in a time and setting the reader up to understand that time is really what's incredible about how he writes. But beyond the technical aspects of that, there's a certain elegance to writing. I don't think I have this. It's really unique. It's an ability to write about people and time in a way that transcends normal writing. And I want to give you an example of this, about how TJ submerges readers in a biography. His biography of Custer grapples with the way Americans conceptualize the frontier and how the power dynamics of the period contributed to freedom struggles, particularly with Native Americans and white settlers. So how does he take us there? Well, you would think he would talk about the West. He would give us a picture of what the West looks like. And he does that too, in very vivid description. But my favorite way in which he does this is through literature. And I want to read you a passage from that book. It's very short, but I think it shows you how he takes you from point A to somewhere completely different and then brings you back to point B, which is where you expect to be. So he does this through Leo Tolstoy. He's a Russian writer who writes at this time. And he's obviously far from the United States, yet it's beautiful. This is what he writes. In the novel War and Peace, Tolstoy wrote that the French invasion of Russia in 1912 did not take place because Napoleon willed it, but because hundreds of thousands, even millions of Frenchmen desired it. How did we get to Napoleon? From Custer, from the Western frontier. Well, this is what he says. In the midst of this masterwork of storytelling, Tolstoy paused to argue that the mass of humankind drives events, not those few who project the illusion of power and who believe the illusion themselves. So I mean, this is master storytelling. He's talking about a master storyteller, but this is a master storyteller taking us through Tolstoy to the American frontier. It's one of the many gems that mark TJ as a master craftsman, and I look forward to the biography of Roosevelt that he's working on at the moment, which will undoubtedly shape our perception of the past and of the man himself. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from TJ about Roosevelt's position on Native American rights and on sovereignty and on citizenship. Please welcome TJ Stiles.
Hello, I'm TJ Stiles. I'm here to introduce the next speaker. What's that? We're out of time? I'm sorry. No, I want to start off by mentioning something. I actually really like Roosevelt, which is important because my previous three subjects are people who are often very unlikable. And I'm talking about one of the most difficult aspects for someone who likes him of his life. And the point is not to blame him or excuse him, but to understand the times through him and to understand him through the times and to piece it apart and examine it rather than blame or excuse. And I'm going to start, I guess this doesn't work. Okay. How do we advance it? That's it. Thank you. August 15th, 1898. Theodore Roosevelt returned from Cuba with the Rough Riders. Their transport ship, the Miami, docked at a pier in Montauk, Long Island. Later that day, he delivered a formal statement about the regiment to the press. Quote, I think we have about every race and every religion of our people represented, though the men are 90% native-born. We have men from the East and West, Indians, half-breeds, and whites. We judge each man purely on his merits. If he can fight and march and has the knack of commanding men, he will go up. Now, except for what's now not acceptable language, this is TR at his best. It's not perfectly accurate. Black soldiers were confined to the 4 Buffalo Soldier regiments of the regular army, but it reflects his own belief in equal opportunity, equal dignity, in judging each person by his merits. It speaks of an Americanism, as he called his patriotism, that was broad and welcoming. But his ideas about race were notoriously more complicated than that, and especially when it comes to the subject of Native Americans, who I'm going to be focusing on tonight in particular. In many ways, his thoughts reflected America at the time. In some ways, they reflect, I think, a misunderstanding of history and the law, even though he was a historian and had gone to law school himself. But his various types of thinking on the subject also reflect a radical change that took place in the United States Constitution. So I'm going to go back in time to the 1880s. Not far from here, when one morning he rode his horse Manitou from the Maltese Cross Ranch to Medora. He saw 5 men approach on horseback, and he saw that they were natives. As he later wrote, he hopped to the ground and took out his rifle. He brought it to his shoulder and took aim. And immediately, each of the 5 men veered off and slid down to the side of their horses to take cover. The leader dropped his rifle and waved a blanket, and then rode forward with an open hand. He tried to show Roosevelt the pass he'd received from his agency, which allowed them to go to hunt or to trade. He asked Roosevelt if he had any sugar or tobacco. So now the other 4 started to trot slowly toward the 2 men as they spoke. Roosevelt immediately brought up his rifle and shouted at them to keep back. Finally, they rode off, yelling, as he said, the most canonical Anglo-Saxon profanity. Now, Roosevelt suspected that they were Lakotas, or as he said, Teton Sioux. If that's true, let's advance. I'll signal you. Thank you. If that's true, they trace their history in the region at least as far back as 1776, as recorded in their winter counts, the annual pictographical records recorded on buffalo hides. Perhaps these same men may have fought General Alfred Sully's force at the Battle of Killdeer Mountain in 1864, or against Custer in 1876. Some might have performed the sacred sun dance, or served as shirt wearers, or joined Sitting Bull in exile in Canada and returned with him in 1881. Roosevelt stood on their ground, sanctified in their rich and complex history by ritual, politics, power, and blood. But when he looked back on this moment in his autobiography, he called them, quote, savage young bucks. I did not like their actions, and I thought it likely that if I allowed them to get hold of me, they would at least take my horse and rifle and possibly kill me. He wrote even more harshly in his first book on his Dakota adventures. Could you advance it? Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, which was originally published in 1885. He referred to indigenous people as, quote, a set of treacherous, revengeful, and fiendishly cruel savages. Now, there's little evidence that supports his fears of violence, but Hunting Trips suggests another reason for his antagonism. He was in the wrong, and he knew it. Quote, a good deal of sentimental nonsense has been talked about our taking the Indians' land, he wrote. The simple truth is that the Indians never had any real ownership in it at all. Where the game was plenty, they hunted. When my cattle came to the Little Missouri, the region was only inhabited by a score or so of white hunters. Their title to it was quite as good as that of most Indian tribes to the lands they claimed. Yet nobody dreamed of saying that these hunters owned the country. Now that's an extraordinary statement, one that he never retreated from, even as his political vision grew more generous. So what are we to make of it? Now, much of it is personal. Call it defensiveness or insecurity. Roosevelt's ranching business was both his biggest, could you advance it? His biggest financial investment, and it was a defining personal adventure. It gave him a sense of moral superiority over his peers back east, his fellow patricians, because it proved that he was willing to get his hands dirty on the ranch as in politics. He was not, quote, sentimental, but he was tough. He did not like to be challenged on the morality of ranching on stolen land. Even more to the point, he identified with the settlers who had colonized North America. When he turned to writing history in The Winning of the West, he filled the pages with footnotes in which he explained the pioneers, his subject, with expressions like, I myself have. So that identification with the pioneers, with settlers, that self-conscious toughness, came out of that came his most notorious and infamous comments on natives. In 1886, many of you are familiar with this, in a talk about the West at the Young Men's Institute in New York, he said, quote, I suppose I should be ashamed to say that I took the Western view of the Indian. I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. Now, I think he was probably joking, but a quip about murdering 90% of the native population could shock the American conscience even at the time. He added, quote, the most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian. He claimed, again, they were reckless, revengeful, fiendishly cruel. He blamed their cultures, which he dismissed as vicious idleness. Any talk of native rights to the land made him feel insecure because he himself owned no land in Dakota. Like other ranchers in the great cattle boom of the 1880s, he put his livestock on federal land, paying no rent and no fees. He was a squatter. He couldn't admit that the savage Indian had a better claim than he had. But this is not just a personal story. It's more than his personal insecurity. Notice whom he picked for an analogy with native nations. Hunters, unconnected, random hunters. Now, wandering hunters did not amount to a people, let alone a nation. They were merely individuals doing the same thing, hunting. In equating them with natives, Roosevelt stripped the latter down to individuals. This is really key to understanding his thinking. He denied natives' national identities, their languages, culture, diplomatic agreements, and government structures. To do so, he had to ignore the historical and legal record, though he himself, again, was a historian and former law student. Now, before the Civil War, the US Constitution, as interpreted by the courts, recognized groups. Chief Justice John Marshall, could you advance it? Thank you. Grappled with natives as nations, while Roger Taney declared infamously in the Dred Scott decision that the descendant of Africa, quote, has no rights which a white man was bound to respect. Even the Bill of Rights, which is now seen as the great bastion of individual freedom and liberty, was taken by Marshall to limit only federal action. States were free to ban abolitionist literature, or limit the vote to professing Christians, or ban speeches about slavery. 4 free states in 1860 banned the immigration of free African Americans. So again, we have an America in which the Constitution is taken to recognize groups and on a much weaker level recognize individuals. It's a constitution of groups. Now, unlike Roosevelt, Marshall recognized native nations as political entities, establishing and also limiting their sovereignty and rights to the land in 3 major cases decided by the US Supreme Court. If you could turn it, please. Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1831, and Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. Quote, Marshall wrote, quote, the condition of the Indians in relation to the United States is perhaps unlike that of any other 2 people in existence. Now, he was sympathetic, but he was realistic. Marshall found that native nations were sovereign, but not completely. They had a right to occupy the land, but not the ultimate title to it. He declared that they were subject to, quote, the right of discovery. In a region discovered by a particular European state, the people living there were said to fall under the discoverer's sovereignty. Quote, however extravagant the pretension of converting the discovery of an uninhabited country into conquest may appear, Marshall wrote, long usage had made it the law of the land and cannot be questioned. Only the discovering nation and no other European power could make treaties with the indigenous tribes within its claim. The United States, he said, had inherited the discovery rights of Britain when it became independent. So, if you could turn it one more, please. Marshall was sensitive to the logical absurdity of playing finders keepers with human societies. He stressed that native nations had, quote, an unquestioned right to the lands they occupy and to self-government. But he declared the tribes within the declared boundaries of the United States to be, quote, domestic dependent nations, existing in a state of pupillage, essentially wards of a guardian republic. Still, their lands could only be taken if they agreed to it. Georgia tried to take over Cherokee land within the state boundaries. Marshall said only the US government could negotiate with them. Now, his views, one more please. His views were challenged from both sides. And it's very important because, again, we hear in the 1830s the articulation of ideas that either Roosevelt ignored or else that he very much adopted. The Cherokee Nation challenged this in its case against Georgia, and it denied the right of discovery in explicit terms. It declared, quote, from time immemorial, the Cherokee Nation have composed a sovereign and independent state. It mocked the idea that it had lost its sovereignty because 2.5 centuries before, a subject of the English king stood on a ship and, quote, looked upon the face of the coast without even landing on any part of it. The Cherokees claimed full sovereignty, quote, deriving their title from the Great Spirit, who is the common father of the human family and to whom the whole earth belongs. I apologize for reading this talk, by the way. There's so many quotes. I don't want to mess anything up. So that is a direct attack against this principle that Marshall declared they simply can't avoid, which is a European comes along, sees something, and then that falls under the sovereignty of that person's monarch. But Marshall's decision, though it rejected that idea, did not go far enough for others who claimed that natives had no rights whatsoever. So the defendant in Johnson v. McIntosh argued, quote, they, native peoples, remain in a state of nature and have never been admitted to the general society of nations. The laws treat them as an inferior race of people without the privileges of citizens. the General Society of Nations. I'm going to come back to that. Associate Justice William Johnson went further. Quote, the law of nations would regard Indian tribes as nothing more than wandering hordes, held together by ties of blood and habit, having neither laws nor government beyond what is required in a savage state. He called natives a race of hunters, connected in society by scarcely a semblance of organic government, who had no sovereignty whatsoever. Could you advance it, please? Now, these are ridiculous claims. To make them, Johnson himself had to ignore fortified settlement, extensive cornfields, long-distance trade, and the diplomacy of indigenous nations with each other, both in the east and in the west of the continent. But his descent was part of the intellectual tradition, a pretty lazy intellectual tradition, that Roosevelt drew upon. Note Johnson's emphasis on wandering and being mere hunters. They didn't use the land in the proper way in his mind, in the European way, and so they scarcely occupied it at all. Roosevelt later wrote of American pioneers moving into, quote, waste spaces. The fact that these lands were already occupied and being used in a different way didn't matter to him, if they were not occupied and used in the European fashion. Quote, the sentimental historians speak as if the blame had been all ours, and the wrong all done to our foes, he wrote in Winning of the West, identifying again personally with his subjects. The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages. Let the sentimentalists say what they will. The man who puts the soil to use must of right dispossess the man who does not, or the world will come to a standstill. So to him, native space was waste space. Now, if he had made the argument on practical grounds, that this was a mass movement of peoples, that it wasn't simply a matter of government choice, he would have been on more solid ground. But he's actually making a moral case for seizing these lands so that they can be used in a different way, and also by his own people, as he identifies. Now, Roosevelt, Johnson, and many others imagined a world in which there was either civilization or savagery, a primitive state of nature. What I like to say is something different. As a historian, as somebody trying to get away from the value judgments that were made then and also made now, I like to talk about the collision of two world systems. I'm stealing a term from a scholar named Emanuel Wallerstein, who was talking about actually something completely different. So if you ever encounter this term, ignore me. But in a world system, the way I'm using it, there may be many different nations, societies, cultures, but languages, even forms of trade, certainly religions. But the people within that world system recognize each other. They're able to deal with each other. They recognize each other's sovereignty, their military power. They trade with them. They make war with them. They have diplomacy with them. They all get each other. They understand the terms of their relationship. Now, when the Europeans, who eventually developed, of course, the most powerful world system in the world, we all live in it now, when they came to North America, they encountered not just random tribes, but an indigenous world system. Certainly not with the power of the technology of the Europeans, and not in the same numbers, but they had their own system for cooperating with each other, fighting with each other, trading with each other. And here we have, the famous example of wampum, and we show an early version of the net of native nations as they existed in North America. So when the Europeans got here, they didn't recognize that this was a world system. They simply slapped down their own boundaries over the existing map. It was only the natives' armed force, their rapid adaptation of military technologies from Europe, that ultimately coerced Europeans into making treaties with them and extending them at least some level of recognition to their polities. And again, terms are so difficult because all of our terms we use are from Europe eventually. Nation. What is a nation? What is a boundary? What is sovereignty? These are terms taken from one world system that inadequately describe concepts and ways of life in the other world system. Now, a believer in manifest destiny, Theodore Roosevelt accepted as natural the removal policy put in motion by President Andrew Jackson. What it did was expel and geographically confine the native world system at great cost to Indian nations and people. He thought it only logical that Americans should barge into indigenous lands to exploit natural resources in their own fashion, our own fashion, as he would put it, be it gold in California and Georgia and Colorado and the Black Hills, or farmland in Oregon, or the grasslands of the plains. In the winning of the West, TR recognized that lands acquired by the United States within the European world system, and again, that's my insertion, world system, say the Louisiana Purchase, which was a transaction with France, then had to be acquired a second time from the indigenous world system. He claimed the United States paid to Indians 10 times what it paid to European powers. In the case of the Louisiana Purchase, it was actually 13 times, not counting treaty annuities. But TR argued that that was foolishness, again, keeping with his consistent claim that they had no title. Yet Roosevelt was not a product of the antebellum Constitution. So his thinking about the natives not being a legitimate group actually comes from a great revolution that occurred after the Civil War, during Reconstruction and its aftermath. Reconstruction transformed the Constitution into a charter of universal individual liberty. The 14th Amendment in particular, which went into effect in 1868, established birthright citizenship and prohibited states from violating the Bill of Rights. So it finally extended protections for individuals and our basic freedoms from incursion by state and local governments. Though it actually took the Supreme Court another 60 years to agree to that, but it certainly was in the intent of the framers. Driven by the activism of the emancipated, the 14th Amendment and changes in Reconstruction, such as the first Civil Rights Act, established a sweeping idea of America as a land open to all, each individual protected in civil liberties. It would not be fully enforced, of course, for at least another century, but these principles were revolutionary. They created the Constitution we know, and in many ways the America we know, even as much as it wasn't enforced properly. The 14th Amendment withheld its protections from Indians not taxed, that is, those who were still outside of the European world system. But its universal provisions, its universal vision, along with the complete downfall of slavery, had an ironic effect. It eliminated any room outside the European world system within US borders. If everyone can belong, then nobody should be outside the system. The rationale of a constitution of groups is gone. Groups should no longer be recognized. And that came increasingly to the fore in the later years as individual liberty was used as a weapon against tribal sovereignty or group autonomy. So the same Constitution that passed the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871, which enforced voting rights against local terrorism, basically, which led Grant to launch a massive enforcement campaign, which I'll discuss in a moment. That same Congress revoked recognition of Native sovereignty and ended the practice of making formal treaties with Native nations. So again, on one hand, they're creating one of the great landmarks still in force today for liberty. On the other hand, they're revoking the group rights and sovereignty of Native people, the very same Congress. Grant, when he became president, said in his first inaugural address, "I will favor any course toward them, natives, which tends to their civilization and ultimate citizenship." So this launched a so-called peace policy. But right there in the words, you see that he's not working for peaceful coexistence, but rather a not always peaceful assimilation. To absorb natives, he had to break down their autonomy, their cultural distinctiveness. In fact, one of his models in this respect was Eli Parker, who was a Seneca who had gotten an education, became an engineer, worked as Grant's military secretary, and whom he made his first commissioner of Indian Affairs. During this time, we have to remember that there were many Native nations, especially in this region, Lakotas and Cheyennes and others, who retained sovereignty in practice, who controlled vast areas, and for whom the native world system, which had existed since pre-Columbian days, was still very much alive. There were still wars that they were waging against their neighbors. They were still carrying out the economy that they had developed since the arrival of the horse. They had long-distance trade. They had all the makings of a separate world system. And yet, increasingly, as the West was first crossed and then finally colonized by white Americans, then Grant gave in each case, to developing the United States. So, for example, I always give the wrong date, the 1872 Mining Act, which Grant signed, which basically opened the West to virtually fee-free mining. It was a part of this vision of rapid development. And when that vision of rapid development came into conflict with native sovereignty and rights, then he sided with the man who had the great peace policy, probably personally was a good person, but he always gave in to development rather than native rights, including launching the Little Bighorn campaign to take the Black Hills, waging war against the Wallowa Band of the Nez Perce, as well as other battles and wars. After the final conquest in 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which allowed the president to subdivide the reservations into family allotments and then to sell off the remainder. This was a deliberate attempt to destroy the sovereignty, the national identity of natives. So now we finally get back to TR. In 1889, he took a job that he held for the longest before he became president, which was United States Civil Service Commissioner. Now, I have to say, I certainly thought this was the most boring job possible he could have taken. It was like he was head of HR for a few years. But in fact, this was a part of a revolutionary effort to change, I should say, to revolutionize democracy, to reinvent it, to take away the element of party patronage, in which parties would get elected to power and then they would clear out all the office holders and jam in, reward their supporters with jobs. To take away the idea of politics as a search for rewards and for rewarding your people, patronage networks, to becoming a party of competence and a party of great technical ability, so that you would vote not for a reward, but you would vote for the policies. The result led to a more competent government, and already government was becoming more and more technical. And also the parties gradually moved less toward rewarding their followers and more toward implementing policies that they tried to sell to the public. During his 6 years in this position, though, TR also went on a personal education in the federal government and how it interacted with citizens. He made many tours of the US, going to post offices, going to custom houses, and also in 1892 on a major tour of Western Indian reservations. Now, this was a pivotal moment for him. As he went to boarding schools and to Western reservations, he really interacted for the first time with Native people, one-on-one. And he came to the conclusion that they were actually human beings who deserved decent lives and would make good citizens. He even endorsed interracial marriages. At Pine Ridge, he hailed the agent, Captain Hugh Brown, for his focus on, quote, the welfare of the Indians under him. Now, this was, seems like boilerplate, but this was a significant change for Roosevelt. He stopped talking about savages and barbarians who were revengeful, et cetera, et cetera. He's now talking about them as fellow citizens. But that was even though they weren't citizens yet for the most part, but that was at the individual level. Again, when he considered them as individuals, it was a different story from when he considered them collectively. He denounced everything that was theirs, that defined Native people as their own nations, as peoples. So their religions and languages, their self-government, their now eclipsed economies and environmental adaptations, all this he dismissed as a wild state, an animalistic existence to be abandoned on the road to civilization. He had no sympathy for diversity, for preserving their group identities and culture. Dancing, for example, formed a critical part of Lakota culture. Warrior dances declined in the 1880s after a military defeat, but they were surpassed by the Omaha dance, which featured gift-giving to honor generosity. Roosevelt wrote that, quote, the Omaha dance was clung to with great tenacity by the old heathen party. This is a very bad custom and a great check to the progress of the Indians. Progress, in his mind, meant the death of Native cultural as well as political distinctiveness. Now, Roosevelt praised reservation day schools and boarding schools because they pushed assimilation. He admired the institution in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, run by Richard Henry Pratt, who notoriously said he wished to kill the Indian and save the man. Parents felt coerced into sending their children to such schools. Sometimes they were kidnapped. Schools banned their languages, religions, clothing, hairstyles, traditions, even their names. TR wrote approvingly that only a few of the returning students, quote, had sunk back to the level of the ordinary Indians. Even worse, he received an anguished appeal from a teacher at Carlisle, Adela Rankin, who detailed Pratt's system of, quote, petty tyranny and meanness, injustice, and wrong. She listed such punishments as placing children on a diet of bread and water for up to 2 weeks, hanging boys from their thumbs, and locking them into, quote, cold cells and dungeons until they are chilled to the heart, so that many of cases of death have resulted from pneumonia, all in the beautiful cause of breaking their wills, humbling their pride, and crushing out all manhood and womanhood. Roosevelt merely forwarded the letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, noting that it was outside his jurisdiction. The whistleblower Rankin was fired, and the abuses continued. Now, in many ways, TR proved diligent on his tour. Few federal officials inspected life on Western reservations more closely. He examined childhood mortality, food quality, bedsteads, wash tubs, farm equipment, employment, health care, the civil service, and even attended a baseball game in Kansas. He reported that the indigenous team won over a white one, 15-8. So he cared about the people. Again, you know, this is Roosevelt, the guy we can like. He actually cares about the individual human beings, but he scorned what made them peoples. He denied the legitimacy of their ancient world system, repeated his argument that they never owned the land. He only acknowledged their political structures in passing. He attended one council at the Yankton Agency who complained that the government had not paid them their treaty annuities. I answered them that I was glad they did not get any money and that they would never amount to anything until they worked and struggled for themselves. Again, this is very much the Roosevelt of personal striving, the Roosevelt that in other contexts had so many admirable ideas, with these same ideas. But this was a rejection of group rights, let alone sovereignty. He accepted them as individuals only, to be elevated in his mind and converted. He fully endorsed the Dawes Act's breakdown of reservations and tribal cohesion. Now, this was not unusual thinking. The irony is that the government's assault on native autonomy and sovereignty, this universal vision of being American, gained force from Reconstruction. Again, the great advance of racial equality and individual rights. As the legal scholar Maggie Blackhawk has written, the constitutional struggle of Native and Black Americans were different. But we, like TR, have a tendency to see the European world system as a given, as universal. And now many people see the Black experience as paradigmatic in other contexts where it is not necessarily so. After returning from this tour, TR went to see the sentimentalists. So he attended, actually, those are the reservations as they were being broken down. This is the Mohawk Conference. So he went to the Lake Mohawk Conference of self-described Friends of the Indian, which his wife Edith described or dismissed as Indian cranks. Now, this reform movement went back at least as far as 1880, when former Commissioner of Indian Affairs George Manypenny published Our Indian Wards, which was an attack on how they were treated. The next year, Helen Hunt Jackson wrote A Century of Dishonor, and various organizations began to emerge. 1883 came the first annual Lake Mohawk Conference of the Friends of the Indian, which I believe is held by the Indian Rights Association, among others. Now, it must be stressed, these are decidedly Christian reformers. They criticized federal dishonesty and abuses, but they did not respect Native sovereignty and culture. Helen Hunt Jackson, in her famous book, wrote, of the fairness of holding that ultimate sovereignty belonged to the civilized discoverer as against the savage barbarian, there's no manner or ground for doubt. Liberal politician Carl Schurz, who was Roosevelt's friend and was Secretary of the Interior under President Hayes, wrote that same year, the end to be reached with natives is unquestionably their gradual absorption into the great body of American citizenship. As with Roosevelt, they saw civilization as the negation of Indian. The European world system must crush what remains of the native. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that citizenship was bad and the equal participation in US democracy and society was bad. Indeed, it was necessary as the native world system was extinguished. But the idea of that they retained group rights, that they deserved autonomy and cultural distinctiveness of their own, was anathema to the most progressive people in terms of treating them fairly. Now, in some ways, he was more egalitarian than many of them when he wrote that individual natives could rise, quote, to a complete level with the whites. As noted, he went out of his way to praise their courage in battle in Cuba as members of his regiment. But when it came to policy, then he ignored indigenous voices who pleaded for respect, autonomy, and sovereignty. Now, unfortunately, his thinking on this question advanced no further. In his first first annual message to Congress, he said, "In my judgment, the time has arrived when we should definitely make up our minds to recognize the Indian as an individual and not as a member of a tribe." He praised the Dawes Act as a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. Now, again, this was the consistent US policy after the Civil War. Every administration had pushed this, but TR had given time and thought to it, and he very much embraced that vision. Now, I'm just going to wrap up by noting that I'm focusing on TR's conception of Native America, but I need to briefly contrast it with his more complicated thinking about African Americans. Now, forced by slavery to make a new people out of many, Africans developed a political vision of birthright citizenship even before the Civil War. Their actions during the war were critical to destroying slavery, indeed making it a necessity, and remaking the Constitution. Not only freed but enfranchised, they became extremely politically active and provided the bastion of Republican strength in the South during and after Reconstruction, as we're going to hear in one of the talks tomorrow, which I really look forward to. TR had worked with black politicians in New York State and nationally, famously helping to elevate John Lynch of Mississippi, congressman and future federal office holder, to become the temporary chairman of the Republican Convention in 1884. Now, he still wrote in many of his writings of Africans and African Americans as an inferior race. And while this is wrong, and he was capable of seeing it was wrong at the time, it's also true that he had a dynamic idea of race, that it was a dynamic scale of progress rather than a set of fixed positions. It was a vague concept for him, including nationality, ethnicity, and as well as color. So in this elastic idea of races, he saw the relative status more as a matter of current circumstance and genetic destiny. The Americanness of black people prevented him from seeking into the sweeping bigotry of his Columbia University professor, John Burgess, who wrote, quote, "A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never, therefore, created any civilization of any kind," which is the purest bunk. By contrast, Roosevelt criticized the Jacksonians in his biography of Thomas Hart Benton because they tended to, quote, blindly deify a majority, not of the whole people, but merely of a small fraction consisting of those who happen to be of a certain sex, to have reached a certain age, to belong to a certain race. He added, quote, "There is no more natural right why a white man of 21 should vote than there is why a Negro woman under 18 should not." Now, you know, Roosevelt is very much capable of knocking us on our butts in shock, and also sometimes in just admiring that he was capable of such thinking when so few Americans were who were not black. It's very unusual thinking. By contrast, the famous historian of the West, Francis Parkman, wrote an article titled "The Failure of Universal Suffrage." So he's breaking with his peers, but of course, again, this does not make him a hero who got everything right. He had many problems with African Americans, with his views of them. But he critiqued a nakedly racist book by Charles Henry Pearson, National Life and Character, for its wild alarms about the threat to white people of Chinese and Africans. Roosevelt thought it ignored human development. By the time Africans pose a military threat to Europe, he wrote, the Negro might be as intellectual as the Athenian. And in fact, many were. He preached individual development, which is how he saw races developing. We ourselves, he wrote, meaning white people, are not certain that progress for white people is assured. We only assert that it may be assured if we but live wise, brave, and upright lives. Again, the general depends upon the individual. Now, as a civil service commissioner, he took notice when the Washington Bee, a major black newspaper in the capital, complained on December 23, 1893, that President Cleveland's Treasury Department was carrying out mass firing of black women who worked as printer's assistants. These were classified jobs. You could only get them by passing a competitive examination, and you weren't supposed to be fired except for cause. The black women involved were largely graduates of the new black colleges established after the Civil War, what we now call HBCUs. One of them, Maria Chase, took second place out of 500 candidates who took the exam, including mostly white candidates. The white Southerner who ran her department under Cleveland sacked her and refused to hire any more black women, regardless of their test results, because he believed they generally tended to be inefficient. Roosevelt investigated and authored a furious report. The commission, he wrote, did not believe that the line of cleavage between efficiency and inefficiency could, by a mere coincidence, so closely follow the color line. There has been a very marked discrimination on the grounds of color. Now, unfortunately, the commission was powerless to do more than report. The women stayed fired. Even more unfortunate, this is far from the whole story about TR. He was not passionate about racism in American society, generally speaking. He viewed it from a remove. So he made no crusade against lynching. He harbored racist assumptions that would flare up. On San Juan Hill, for example, when he assumed that many black troops, after the fighting was done, were shirking, when in fact they were just trying to find out where their regiment was. Or in the so-called Brownsville incident, when he dismissed 167 innocent black soldiers from service under a mistaken impression they committed violence. He viewed Asians as inherently incapable of assimilation. So Theodore Roosevelt was a man with prejudices, sometimes leading to harsh results. But in zeroing in on the differences in his attitude between Native Americans and black Americans, in the fine points of how he talked about individuals versus groups, we see that his ideas about Americanism and about equality were defined by a kind of compulsory universalism. Black Americans struggled to integrate fully into American society, to be participants in and beneficiaries of a republic they had built. He saw and embraced that to a large extent. The question for indigenous people was different in his mind. There, the question was sovereignty, autonomy, maintaining group rights and identity, some self-determination and existence outside of the European world system while they're still living inside of it, as well as fighting for the right to participate in that society. Now, he wished to compel Native Americans to participate in Native society, in the European world system, by destroying their world system and what made them distinctive. What's disheartening is, had his Americanism not been so intolerant of diversity, so fixated on a single identity for Americans, with his knowledge, he might easily, and his power, he might easily have diverted the history of Native people onto a different and healthier track. But he simply was not that man. Thank you very much. Hello.
Well, thank you. An extraordinary keynote lecture. Thank you very much. Troubling. And here's a question I have, and it's kind of just an emotional, intuitive question. To quote him saying, I won't say that the only good Indian and so on, it's so dark and illiberal and ugly that I have a hard time uttering it. And I wonder how you feel about having to put together this compilation of some of the really ugliest things that Theodore Roosevelt ever had to say. It's important that we know this, of course, but where are you when you, as a citizen and as a man, in addition to being a scholar, when you look at this?
I'm kind of in the opposite position of when I wrote about Custer, when I had to keep reminding him that there are reasons why people liked him. And again, I like TR. I think he was one of the most impressive and important presidents for good reasons, certainly even before his presidency, that he elevated ideals at personal cost to himself, which were revolutionary and essential to the development of our nation. So it's disappointing. It's kind of heartbreaking emotionally. But the question is then, again, I think that we both cannot look away from these things. As a biographer, I have to look at a person in full. And human beings are contradictory, and they fail us. They will disappoint us. That's true of family as well as certainly politicians. But the question then is, where's that coming from? How does that fit into the world he's in? The most disappointing, like I said about Custer, really the worst thing about him was that in the West, in his treatment of Native Americans, he was typical, in the Army. I mean, that's what's really heartbreaking. And TR was actually not as bad as some, but that's not hardly an excuse. But understanding the changing ways in which people are thinking about citizenship and about the way in which we had shifted from dealing with Native Americans as their own people with their own self-government to simply trying to crush out anything that was theirs was a much bigger story. And he played a part in that, an unfortunate part. But that is, as the historian side of being a biographer, that's got to be equally as important as, his own personal failings. And he did grow personally when he actually began to think about, people as human beings. His ideas changed, his language changed, but his ideas in a larger sense, did not, unfortunately.
But that famous sentence that you quoted, I won't say, and so on, is often taken out of context as characterizing Roosevelt's view of things. But about the same time, in 1886, when the Haymarket riots occurred in Chicago, he said, well, some of my ranch hands out here are really good shots. If we took them to Chicago, they'd make short work of the... Yeah. But then he became a moderately pro-labor president. So, I mean, when he was young, he was kind of a rhetorical hothead. Yes. And he never lost that entirely, but I believe we don't want to lock him into that statement, do we?
I could be wrong, but I believe he was speaking to an audience of boys when he was in that 1886 talk. So he was trying to really play it up, I think, the Western thing. The other thing is that personally, again, what I like about, Richard White dismissed his playing cowboy, and, he was, rich man, is play acting, being a cowboy. Well, with that view of his being a rancher, then that means he would be okay and immune to criticism if he'd stood in a tuxedo on his front porch and with a cup of coffee and issued orders instead of actually taking part in the work. I mean, he wanted to be a part of the work. He wanted to personally see to the success. And he identified with people in the West. He loved the people he met. And so when he runs into natives, they're always across the divide. And on this side are the people he's identifying with, who he's working with, when they made fun of him, he accepted it and laughed at it. He knew, he admitted he wasn't a good writer. All these things, he's really authentic and enjoying the company and the camaraderie of Western people, white Western people. And so he adopts their view and looks across this divide and, they're coming to rob me, when, that would only make more trouble for themselves. It was ridiculous. But, part of that is who is he identifying with? When he says, I take the Western view of the Indian, that is a real key to where he started from. So he's going to adopt their worst attitudes toward the other guy. And then later as a commissioner, then he actually has to deal with their lives and as human beings, and his rhetoric certainly changes.
He softens, but not perhaps as much as one would hope, right, in the later life. I know the audience has questions. I want to ask another one before we go on about that incident. You started with it, and he writes about it, that leaving his ranch, he runs into 5 native people. Mm-hmm. They're probably not Lakota, they're probably Hidatsa. He was up near the Killdeer Mountains, and the Hidatsa were related to the Lakota, but only linguistically. And he then has this standoff, and he then describes it in sort of self-heroic terms, how he alone was able to keep them from menacing him and so on, or worse. How much of this comes from those boys novels that he was reading, Mayne
Oh, yeah,
Reid
that's-
and The Buffalo Hunter, and isn't he play acting a little bit and imposing a really simplistic Western paradigm on this incident?
Yes, he is. Play acting suggests that he wasn't sincere. I think he fully believed
Was
it.
sincere.
I think so. I don't think he was like pretending, you know? I mean, I don't see any evidence that, you know, he didn't really think this, but his attitude was fully formed by everything from novels to probably yarns around the campfire to, you know, I mean, he's totally absorbing that and loving it and eating it up.
Those early things he read seem to have really percolated into his desire
Yeah.
of how you are a man in the West.
I totally think that. Absolutely.
And so, you know, one could wish his reading were a little more widespread when he was that age. But I want to ask one more question before turning to the audience. You know, you quoted him saying that justice was on their side of the settlers. That however
No, he
bad
said our side.
Right, our side.
Yes.
That however bad it could be, justice was on our side. What did he mean by the word justice? So, I mean, this is kind of a strange term, justice. Why is it just for white Anglo-Europeans to dispossess native peoples? What's the justice he's talking about?
Well, this is the sort of thing I love to do, actually, is to really pick apart what, you know, these quotes and as well as contextualize them. Again, you know, so you think about the idea of, there's two things that he gets particularly worked up about. The concept that Native Americans might actually possess the territory they occupy for centuries, and the idea that they're not using it, or they're using it wrong, that it's waste space. And that, again, you know, progress, the whole idea of progressive, which, you know, sometimes we equate with equality and rights and things, you know, was seen at the time as, you know, economic progress, as technological development, scientific progress. And he certainly thought that, you know, putting the soil, the resources to use the proper way was very much justice. I think that he really, in his own fashion, had this idea that, I talked about of the native world system is not really a world system, that it's just barbaric savages wandering around, and that the legitimate organization of society is what we bring, and that the legitimate political organization of this terrain and the proper use. Now, you know, he was not a big defender of, you know, he didn't go to bat for the so-called 5 civilized tribes, you know, that had adopted a lot of technology from
governments.
Yeah, and but you know, his general attitude of you know, we're right because we're us, really. Again, it connects to his you know, his deep identification with this vague idea of Americanism, I think, and that there is, you know, a just and true society, brave and noble, and, you know, the Americans can't be wrong. You know, there's a lot of like kind of emotional subtext to it as well. I don't think it's well reasoned rationally. I don't think he really looked at it in a scholarly sense and very deeply.
Because I think what he's saying is it's good that we did this and advantageous that we did this.
Yes.
But when he uses the word justice, he's clothing that land grab in moral hierarchies, which he tends to do.
Yes.
And so it's a term that needs to be deconstructed, right? Because
Yeah.
to make the claim that this is justice would be disputed if you had a number of other stakeholders in the room, right?
I mean, John Marshall is telling them they can't do that,
Right.
and they go ahead and do it. So yeah, he can't look too closely at the actual legal context because it undermines his case, and he has to imbue farming and, you know, land development as with moral qualities, you know, and that if you have especially after European diseases arrived, probably in the 1400s, you know, diminished population. So you have low population density, very rational use of, in many different ways, very rational exploitation of natural resources, very sophisticated, you know, diplomacy and trade, etc. And he just doesn't see that. He just can't accept it because that would undermine the moral case that's so important to him.
I'm sure there are questions, so raise your hand, please, and please speak up. Here's one right here, and then right behind you.
In the, or rather, shall I say, How's your interpretation of TR and his attitudes toward the Filipinos? How are you interpreting that aspect of TR in the light of what you've commented on with respect to Native Americans and blacks?
That's a really
There's that
great
whole other
question.
world.
And it includes the Cubans as well, I would say. It's interesting. I'm currently opening my chapter on the war with Spain with a moment in the mid-1890s when Jose Marti went with General Gomez to Barnum and Bailey in New York at Madison Square Garden, and advertised, because Marti, who lived in New York for 10 years, loved the circus, absolutely loved the circus. So he was making up with Gomez, who was the military leader of the Cuban Revolution. And so he took him to the circus, and advertised for that circus was a display of the savage peoples of the world. And so here are two guys who are going to be seen in the same light, sophisticated, educated men, very much a part of the European world system. And they're going to the circus where they see this display of all the primitive peoples of the world. And when the U.S. gets to Cuba, the U.S. military tells the Cuban guerrillas not to fight. And they actually are incredibly important in the campaign. And so, they're kind of upset about this, and they're not taking part in the fighting. And so they're always around, but they're kept out of the fighting. And so Roosevelt writes about them, how they're lazy and they're cowardly, and very much in the terms that he writes in his early writing about natives. And when he writes about the Filipinos, the same thing. He's talking about them as savages who need to be elevated, and that this is a part of the U.S. Mission. And it's very complicated because these are people who've already been colonized, or in Cuba, many are descended from colonizers, and yet this idea of, again, at the center of his idea of civilization is Americanness. That idea of civilization versus barbarism, and how Americanness plays a role in that, is really fascinating. And we could have an entire week of a symposium devoted to just that question alone. So it's definitely his thinking about natives absolutely plays a role in his thinking about these peoples who he's now dealing with. I think it really closes options, for example, in the Philippines. And it limits, he wasn't in charge during the war, but it limited options for the U.S. in Cuba and the freedom of Cuba. That attitude, which many people shared.
And Mark Twain was writing him some really remarkable letters about this very subject to the person sitting in darkness.
Exactly.
Rachel.
So I read somewhere that McKinley actually appointed more black postmasters than Theodore Roosevelt. And I think my understanding, at least, is especially during his second term, you see kind of there wasn't a renewal of some of the appointments for black postmasters. So I just wonder what you make of that. We don't really hear McKinley being trumpeted as someone who was really for African American rights. And obviously there's a lot of discussion around Theodore Roosevelt. So just any thoughts you had on that?
That's a great question. These are my reading glasses. I shouldn't put those on. That's actually a great question. That's a really important point. In that, with everything is double-sided. So civil service reform is hugely important in cleaning up American politics, giving us a professional government that can do its job. The mail, everybody complains about the mail. It's actually amazingly efficient. And these are all civil service jobs. And then I mentioned a positive case of civil service reform where all these jobs get filled by graduates of what are now called HBCUs, et cetera. And he fully endorses that. They got their jobs by passing the test. But the problem is, the other side of patronage is that, and this is actually interesting because it relates to the current gerrymandering case before the Supreme Court, when partisanship and race overlap. And by rewarding black politicians, local politicians and leaders with these patronage jobs, the fourth class postmasterships, it's providing black Republicans who are after 1877 are under siege, let's put it that way. They haven't gone away, they haven't lost all their offices, they're fighting hard, but they have diminished possibilities, and it gives them a real bastion of local authority, everything from income. A lot of local postmasters ran partisan newspapers, and they didn't make enough money from the newspapers to stay alive. And being postmaster allowed you to keep doing that. And it gave them local authority in the community, et cetera. So a lot of Republican presidents after the Civil War are not great heroes when it comes to civil rights, and yet they wanted to maintain a Republican presence in the South, and that meant a black presence. And also within the party, black Republicans took part in national conventions, and they were important players in the Republican Party, even in states where they didn't have, say, federal or state office holders. And so rewarding people was often important for your ambitions for the presidency, et cetera. So I think partisanship can't just be, the spoils system in this sense can't just be lambasted. And yet TR, was moralistic. And he spent so much time working on the civil service reform issue. And again, he tended to view the struggle of African Americans, which he was sympathetic to, but at a remove. It wasn't something, for him, civil service reform was up close. He was totally invested in that. He didn't have that same level of investment in African American struggle and in the black struggle. And so, it was more important to him to show that he was fair and he was nonpartisan in his appointments than it was to, again, maintain this local patronage system, which was so helpful to active black Republicans.
Another question. I guess we're almost out of time, I'm sorry to say. Another question? Just in the back there to the left.
I apologize again for reading. I don't like to read, but I had so much to go through, didn't want to screw it up.
Hi, I wonder if in your reading you came across the fact, or if Theodore Roosevelt brought up the difference between their land allocation system of the Western world versus the Indian nomadic life on the land and essential lack of a legal way of allocating land or a written language. Because that has tended to be the reason that the white man or the Western civilization justifies allocating land the way in which we did. And in New Amsterdam, they, for example, allocated long, thin, narrow plots of land because they were more lucrative for them.
Yeah, I don't go into the entire history of it, but the fact that Native nations and cultures were so diverse. So, for example, the Iroquois are operating in a very different economy. They have fortified settlements. They have a lot of cornfields. Very involved in trade. They also were key players diplomatically between France and Britain, and later Britain and the U.S. And it's actually the U.S. as a result that basically wipes them out and drives them away. I think they had a nickname for Washington, who ordered this great campaign of city burning that was not, village burning was not happy. In the West, you've got a lot of agricultural nations, with fixed settlements. You have fixed settlements, along the Missouri River and mix of horticulture and hunting. Such a diverse system. And yet the way that, again, I read to those writings, not only Roosevelt, but going back to certainly the 1830s and before, whereas this sweeping dismissal of, natives are wandering hunters. They're just hordes of, so again, that dismissal, it was sort of a deeply laid prejudice and a sort of a deeply laid intellectual assumption, which just simply didn't care to actually investigate and digest it and ponder the meaning of it and how the U.S. could interact with, these peoples and account for the different way in which they used, and as you say, deal with land allotment. The different ways in which, the kind of integration and coexistence with, the American European world system could have happened. This kind of creative thinking really never got anywhere near the policymaking level. And there was also the widespread assumption that they would just simply disappear. And Roosevelt himself wrote about how, well, the African in the presence of the white man actually flourishes, but the native people, they tend to disappear. And there was an anticipation they were just simply going to vanish. And that's very deep in a lot of thinking about native people. So there's a lot of just laziness and assumptions and just dealing with natives when they had to, and not giving any real thought to it, that really defines the history of Indian policy, as it was called.
So in your opening remarks, you implied that Roosevelt either knew better than some of the things that he wrote and said, or that he was in a position to know better, that there was a certain laziness in not really examining some of these concepts that were coming out of his pen. And then you said that in a certain way he might be insecure or threatened by this. You're sort of entering into almost a psychological
Yeah, you
read.
have to be careful.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something that, he had this, I think he yearned for this sense of moral superiority. And this sense that he can stand up for himself, that goes back to that stagecoach in Maine when the boys bullied him and he was absolutely no threat to them and they laughed at him. I think that was a psychological scar that the rest of his life, was reflected in a lot of his actions.
He said that will never happen again.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. I think much more than wanting to overcome asthma, I think that not wanting to be ever bullied again, I think was probably the stronger psychological impulse. And so when he gets out west, this idea that he can take care of himself, and no one's going to bully him, and also no one's going to challenge him. And the idea that he's squatting, and and then people are talking about the Indians' right to the land. I mean, I'm sorry, how exactly that played out. Yes, I haven't done any therapy sessions with him, but surely the issue should be raised that this is a direct contrast, and he's on the wrong end of it. And he's the one who has less of a claim to the land than the natives do. And it's his big issue. He goes off on it. And he mentions it over and over and over again. Oops.
Well, like some others of his time, he had a staged theory of civilization that plays out
Yes.
too in all of that. Chris,
Yeah.
did you have another question? We have to stop, I know.
I'm sorry.
There was one more over there. Let's do that.
I have a question about an honors student with better knees.
They're legion.
Where we at?
Thank you. When I look at this President Roosevelt, as he came out in his youth in 1886, searching for freedom and liberty and justice, something that in his life he had on the East Coast, being in that type of a structure, I forget the type of structure that he came out of the freedom. And my question is, it seems like we're in a time of change, like they were in a time of change, the new frontier, the liberty, the freedom to become, families to become and to exist, compared to what it was back in England and Europe, and the slavery mode and the feudal system of Europe. America was such a great freedom that was taking place out here. Don't you think that because of the oppression that seems to be on America right now, all the division and the frustration and making a living, don't you think that we're ready for a change like what Roosevelt experienced, but it could be in a whole different level?
Wow, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I have my own political ideas, but I don't know that I can, or that I or anybody can justify them on the basis of Theodore Roosevelt. The thing is that Roosevelt was very concerned, and I think this is a great concern, about the fairness and the reliability of democracy. And he believed that women should have the right to vote. He believed that black people should have the right to vote. He said that people should, as he wrote in, I think, the Benton biography, he said that self-governing people make mistakes, but when their own interests are at stake, and they're voting and participating in government based on their own interests, then they're less likely to make mistakes, and they are involved in the decision making. So he had a broad view of democracy, and he had a broad view of participation in government. Now, one of the interesting things about him is that he had many fierce, he was partisan, he was honestly partisan, and yet he was able to, if he thought an opponent who he would argue with all day and denounce, but if he thought they were operating fairly in the system and that allowed everyone a voice, then he would defend that person. And he believed, just like appointing white postmasters, which I think probably in many cases was a mistake, but he was extending to the South, you know, you're a decent person, you're a decent citizen, you're not of my party, but I will give you this position. That he had an opponent who he thought was a morally worthy person who was being honest in politics. He thought, you know, there's no dictatorship. We all have to participate, and we all have to get along in a democracy. And I think that's really how he viewed it. He had much more disgust, much more of a negative attitude toward the people who don't take part than somebody who took part fully, energetically, and was completely disagreed with him. He had a basic admiration and respect for the people who take part. The people who don't take part, and then, you know, they may get run over, they may get what they want, they may get run over, he had no time for. And so this is always the problem of democracy, and I think he really went to the heart of it, which is we all have to participate, we all have to fight for what we want, and then we have to accept the results and keep on fighting. And I think that was very much Roosevelt's attitude.
TJ, I wish we had more time, another hour. We're going to have to stop, but we will have you on the panel on Saturday, and I want to just like seed a question for you. You can give a one-sentence answer now and then a long one on Saturday. I hope everyone will come to that. That's one of the most delightful parts of the week. So the Pope in Canada not so long ago was asked to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, which you talked about in the Marshall Trilogy. Mm-hmm. He did in 2023. He formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which was the legal cover, at least for a lot of the dispossession.
Even non-Catholic countries.
Do you think that that repudiation and rescinding will have measurable effects in the rest of the 21st century?
Well, I don't know. I have no idea. But I'll say this, which is, you know, at this point with native peoples, you know, everywhere, but especially in the Western Hemisphere, you know, this coexistence in a society of nations that is their own, you know, the broad intercultural connections and as their own, you know, tribes and nations as individual citizens who live in urban areas but have family connections to reservations and participate in native culture. You know, this has to be, while rights and participation in, you know, the Western political system that is imposed on them and is not going away, well, we want their full participation in that. The greater respect and the greater encouragement of this diversity, everything that tends toward that, I think is good. And so I think the Pope, you know, showing that respect can only be a good thing, in my view.
Chris, thank you. Thank you, TJ Stiles.